Welcome to the World Builders Anvil, episode 197, World Building and the Sea. Don't know where to start building your fantasy world? Do you need more? Does it make sense? Forget any worries and become a crafter of imagination. This is the place that will help prime your mind. Now, it's time to heat up the forge, break out the mithril ingots and hammer. Welcome to the World Builders Anvil. I'm your host, Jeffrey W. Ingram. Let's sup from the mug of Java and build. Welcome back. As always, my name is Jeffrey W. Ingram.
And salty as always, I am Michael Miller.
I have to leave that joke alone. Okay.
The unfortunate truth is that we're going to be talking about the ocean, and the only reason I say it's unfortunate is because in Jeff's extensive research and preparation for this show, he neglected to include pirates.
Well, this is world building elements.
I know.
So this is more generalistic.
I know. But despite that fact, I still insist on kicking off the show with my absolute favorite pirate joke. Jeff, what is
Hold on. You're about to say a joke you think is good. I have to prepare myself. Okay, continue.
What is a pirate's favorite letter?
R?
No, a pirate's first love be the sea.
Oh, you said that's a good setup joke too,
isn't it?
Yeah.
I that's why I figured I'd lead off with it, because we're talking about the sea.
Talking about the sea, and the sea is a wonderful thing for world building. There's some neat things to keep in mind when you're working with the sea. When you're world building, you can get totally insane with some of this stuff, and I'll mention some of those things along the way if you want to, but I'm not going to get into too much detail because that's why I like naturalistic, because it feels like, but it doesn't necessarily have to be mathematically perfectly correct in my mind. Actually, if you asked me about the title system of my world, I could not really give a great description, but it's important.
What do you mean? Title.
Yes, title.
I thought you said title, like as in like the title of something.
The titles I'm usually pretty good with, but
right.
Title.
Title.
Not so good.
Got you. Okay.
Yeah. So let's start off with probably the most important aspect of oceans when it comes to world building, and that's kind of where the ocean meets the land.
Oh, see, I was going to guess the moon.
That's important, but the reason why the coastlines are so important is, one, your maps will look really ocean or land covered without them, and two, most early people settle in areas either along the ocean where there's good fishing or along rivers where they're fishing. So water itself is always important. But oceans, pretty much since man has existed on Earth, well before civilizations, there has been fishermen out in the ocean.
Tasty fish.
And with tasty fish. I mean, the one that always blew my mind is, they talk about the dispersal of human life from Africa and how it sort of migrated and how exactly it got to Australia, in like really early prehistoric times, I find amazing. And I don't think there's any real true theory that we have about that yet. So, but the interesting thing is to keep in mind, you look at maps from the distance and coastlines look very smooth and very defined, and in real life that's not true. There's a lot of, like, if you go to the southeast United States, you'll see, is a great example of where you have these great marshlands that will sometimes overlap, and so exactly where's the ocean and where's the coastline when you're at the coast is not always as exact as when you're like at a beach in Miami. Keep that in mind. A lot of times you have to deal with stuff like, what we call intercoastal waterways and these really thick marshes, which can stretch out into what are barrier islands out into what we would call the ocean. So, and then you have the fjords where the ocean kind of will shoot in to the land because of deep fissures in the earth, typically in mountainous areas. See those a lot in like northern Spain, and they're great. Beautiful coastlines, and obviously in like Scandinavia, there are fjords, because I think that's where the word probably comes from. And Maine, there's a lot of those kind of features going on as well too. So keep your coast in mind. That's not the first place civilizations will go. But there will be tribal people along the coast before civilizations, and civilizations will get to the coast very early because you learn, unless you have a better transportation method than early humans on Earth have, that traveling by waterway is much faster, especially if you're moving copious amounts of things than it is to do it over land. So it's typically a bit safer as long as you don't get caught, but it's easier to get caught. So this whole piracy thing does become an issue very early in human history, probably pre-civilization.
Now, you are well documented that you are a big map fan. So,
yes.
Before you really got into what was your world building for the book, and it was originally the world building for tabletop, was the landscape, i.e., your coastlines, was that where you started? Or did you first have there's a city and we played in this city? Or did you straight up go, I'm going to create land masses and oceans?
I created land masses, and then I put dots on the land masses, and those were my cities, and I pulled out graph paper and I started making cities in my original version of Gardul, and pretty much every thing since has started with landmass. And I'm a big believer if you're doing a full world building scenario, you start with the map, you start with the coastline to get a feel of what the geography is like, and it kind of gives you the idea of the type of cultural influences that will pervade in certain areas. So just knowing the coastlines is probably, for me, if I'm starting a world from scratch, is the first thing I'm going to do every freaking time.
Good to know.
Ergo, that's why it's so important. Now, the next thing was sort of cheated, and Michael cheated and threw out there.
Oh, I'm sorry. I feel bad because I actually didn't.
I see the shame on your face right now. And since you've had these show notes for like 3 weeks now, you think you would know them?
That's not true. You sent them like 15 minutes ago. Well, I think it's funny because I was recently accused and berated for not reading the show notes. And as I've stated many times before, I almost always read the show notes, and then if we go off them, we go off them. But literally, I just got them a few minutes ago, and I have not read them. We're just kind of going. So
this time, that's definitely true. Usually, in Michael's defense, we actually a lot of times talk about it, and he will typically then not read the notes. He will just simply disregard or ignore the notes because he feels that, the flow of the conversation's important or something.
I don't know. I might have had a reason, but the bottom line is, in the interest of time, we just started recording quicker. We spent less time talking pre-show, so I apologize if I messed up the flow by mentioning something too early.
It's ruined the whole structure of this episode.
All right, so we're going to start again. Now we're going to change the subject. We're going to talk about pirates today. So
he's doing it again, folks.
Get us back to pirates. Arr. There is. I know I'm teasing you guys, but there is a pirate episode coming, and I apologize. That was my phone. There is a pirate episode coming because I insist on it, and I am going to try to convince Jeff to speak in a pirate voice the whole time. I will be speaking in a pirate voice.
He will.
Arr.
Okay, so the next one is the moon is the most obvious thing. It is a misconception that the moon is what causes the tidal forces on Earth.
What?
That's a misconception.
The moon does not influence tides?
I did not say that.
Okay.
I said that it causes tides. And it largely is the major influence, probably by far, on the tidal forces on Earth. But actually, any other gravitational source that's large nearby, like, say, the sun, also does as well, too. Mm-hmm. So I think it would be wrong to say, like, if there's no moon, that there would be no tides. I do think it would be a lot less, and depending on the size of the moon, the number of moons could all affect it. And this is one where, if you want to get realistic,
Jeff, I don't want to, punch a hole in what you're talking about, but we only have the one moon
on Earth. But we're talking about fiction writing, so you might have
that's
one
right.
moon
That's
in the
right.
fictional
That's right.
But you could actually get into some crazy math here to try and figure out what the exact tidal forces are. I think that's crazy.
I was about to say you'd have to do a lot of math because now you'd be talking about.
I've seen this on world building boards, and that's why I say that.
Seriously, you talk about figuring out the mass of the moon. You need to know the density and the mass of the moon, the distance of it from your planet, the density and mass of the planet.
And if there are more than one moon, for each of them, and the distance and total mass, and I think there will probably be no point in the world that people will be watching the water lap up and going, that looks unrealistic.
Be like, no, look, I did the math. It is realistic. This is what would happen.
Yeah. Ha! Eat that. I mean, obviously trig exists to explain such things as tidal forces, but you can go there if you want to understand it from an educational standpoint. But for the most part, I don't think you really need to get crazy into the math. Just say, okay, there are tidal forces. There's like a lot of moon density around my planet. There will probably be stronger and crazier tides. If there is no moon, or a smaller, or it's further away, you're going to have weaker tidal forces, because the moon, I do think, is a very large part of Earth's tidal force. But even a binary sun system is going to really probably screw with the tides of a planet. So keep that one in mind. So you can go crazy with it. I think just keep in mind, if you don't have a moon, it's one of the things that really, I don't know how often this becomes that important in storytelling, if that's why you're doing it, because I can't think of in my, since 1981, maybe, when I started role playing, where someone's actually a player or someone who's read one of my stories is asked, is there more description about how the tide's rolling in? I'm just not getting enough here. Understand that there are tidal forces and they are important, but they're not nearly as important to me as the next one, which are the current and the winds, which create sea current, or surface currents.
Before you move on to your next point, I just wanted to point out, you said, like, if there is a moon, and it didn't dawn on me that you could actually, create yourself a nice little planet and not have a moon. And that just, kind of struck me. That's kind of a neat idea. Be like, no moon in the night sky.
Which is neat for us, but my thought is, how would the characters on the world know or care?
Well, they wouldn't. To them, they wouldn't know that they lack a moon if it's a lower tech level. I would assume, obviously science fiction, if they were planet hopping, and they would know. But
I think it would be cooler.
You as a reader would know that they lack a moon, and how would you?
How would you explain that?
How would you
author?
As the author,
we might have to do an online summit talking about this at some point.
Okay. Well, so I don't want to get too far off it. Just the idea of no moon interested me.
Is an interesting one. I agree. Now, current and winds, I think, is a more important thing. I think something like 80% of life on Earth exists around ocean currents. So
around them, or because of them?
Around them and in them, and or a lot of places even where you have coral reefs are along ocean currents. That's where life on Earth exists in its greatest density, except for maybe Tokyo. They're very important for not only where life is in the water, but they're also, which is really important, especially if you want to create sort of like ocean civilizations. You want your mermen, your merwomen. They are in and about currents, and how does the current affect them? And I think that's one thing that gets missed a lot when you talk about such things, is the importance of not the sea. The sea is like air if you're underwater.
Yep.
It is the current is the important thing, not so much the sea. Depths might be important and have some kind of relevance as well too. But that's the way stuff moves around the planet. That's the way coconuts get to ocean islands, and then palm trees. That's how palm trees took over the ocean islands.
What kind of coconuts?
It wasn't the coconuts. You're thinking swallows.
Okay, yeah, that's true. Hey, look, where'd you get the coconuts?
But the thing to keep in mind is it's the center of life on a planet. And so when currents get close to land, there will be an abundance of life near the land. People on the land can use the currents to move. And in the earlier tech levels, it will be hard to not use the currents to move. It's harder to move against a current than it is to move against the the wind. The wind you can tack in and out of, but a really strong current is pushing against you. And that's the reason why, like, the sailing route to the, between Europe and the United States was a loop, because they would sail out on one current and come back on another.
Yeah, you could design your currents in a fashion that they could only go from point A to point B by circumnavigating the globe, which would be an interesting idea at a low-tech level, because you'd be like, oh, well, they left to explore, but maybe their ship technology was not good enough to cross-current sail. And subsequently, once they got into the stronger currents, they were forced to go and go and go and then just keep going until they came around to the other side.
I found there was a really interesting thing when I was learning about, like, the Polynesians, because they're the people on Earth who colonized the outer Pacific islands, the last places of land on Earth outside of Antarctica that got colonized. And the neat thing was they got to Tahiti and Hawaii around the same time as they got to New Zealand, which is right close to where all of the other islands are. It's actually it's further. It's closer to where they came from than the Polynesian homeland, which is sort of, I believe, in the Samoan Islands. And that's kind of where they branched out from, to Tahiti, to Easter Island, to Hawaii, and to New Zealand. But they got there much later because of currents. It's really hard to actually get to the New Zealand landmass, I guess. So it actually took longer for them to get there than a lot of islands much further out into the Pacific. So currents are really important, you know. And the other interesting thing too about the ocean is it's the oxygen maker. You know, most of the oxygen that we breathe does not come from plant life on land. It comes from plankton and other tiny microorganisms that are in the surface of the ocean. So it'd be a great way to, like, do an apocalypse story, kill off all plant life in the ocean. You know, and watch the civilizations on the planet destroy the stuff on land. And another interesting one too, for storytelling purposes, if you do have like sets inside of water, sound travels 5 times its speed in water than it does in air.
That never made a lot of sense to me, because of course as a kid, what do? You go underwater and you scream and you try to hear your friend talking underwater, and it just never made sense to me. I mean, I get it from a scientific standpoint, you know, water's denser than air and thus it vibrates easier, but I don't get it from a practical perspective, because, you know, I've tried yelling underwater and it's hard to hear.
Well, from a practical, it's just the opposite, like, but it's thicker.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, which is really why it does travel faster. And that probably just falls down on the fallacy of the human ear, in that, well, it, you know, my ear doesn't work as good at receiving the sound as opposed to how the sound travels and could be received in other ways. I can only assume that is the science of it. I am not looking it up right this second, mostly because there is no possible way for me to research something. I do not have the wealth of human knowledge at my fingertips. Oh, wait, I totally do. It's on the internet here somewhere.
Curse you, Google, for making me a liar.
Moving on.
So the next thing you really need to consider, there are 2 things that you really need to consider when you're world building. And that is, do you take the classical view of the ocean on Earth, which is the ocean is an obstacle? Or is the ocean a highway? And there are arguments both ways between anthropologists today over, did the ocean stop or help speed up human movement? And where there's no clear winner there, I think, you know, personally, I think the ocean is more of a highway. There are times it can be an obstacle too. So, you know, I think both things probably will happen. Dead spots in water will make it harder for people to get through that. But in areas with strong currents, it's very easy for people, even, you know, at very low tech levels, even in, let's say, kayaks by themselves on the ocean, to traverse the ocean.
The Inuits did it for a very long time, and I believe they still do.
Yep, and they're probably one of the oldest cultures on Earth, and that probably looks a lot like how many of the early people migrated across oceans were probably in small kayak-like canoes like the Inuits have today. It's just an ancient culture, and I think that's a holdover from humans like I'm going to say 30,000 years ago, but I'm just making that a really freaking long time ago.
And now I realize that you probably know this, as that you are such a study of human culture. But I had a friend of mine who was a master woodworker, and he built his own kayak. He did a whole is one of the most gorgeous boats I've ever seen. He built the whole thing by hand. But he had to learn a lot about kayaks, and subsequently taught me a bit about them in the process. And the interesting thing about I not knowing all of it, I'm not going to broad stroke it and say all Inuit kayaks, but at least a version of kayak that they used to build is that they didn't have a rigid hull. They had these supports that they didn't go from the front to the back of the boat. It was like a ring, like a circle, and it was imagine the ribs of a snake. It was basically like that. So you've got a long tubular thing, which is kind of like what a kayak is shaped, except when it comes to the points on the front and the back. And it's got these ribs through it, but the rest of it was relatively flexible. So the boat itself, as you see it on the water, would actually flex with the waves, whereas most boats don't do that. They cut through them because they're solid. So these Inuit kayaks, to look at them on the water, it doesn't look like they're doing it, but they're actually moving up and down with the motion of the water, and it made them I don't know if it was more stable or safer or just whatever, but that was one of the ways that they built it.
It worked really well.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, that's cool. No, I did not know that. Now, the last thing to remember is I think it's one of the greatest sources of inspiration is there's this form of life called extremophiles, and oftentimes we're looking for species or monsters that are very alien. And so we try and use our imagination, and we come up with the silicon-based life blobs and all kinds of things. On Earth, there's these group of things called extremophiles, and a lot of them are in the ocean. They live in places that we would say could not support life. Like at the bottom of the ocean, where there's a fissure to the magma under the plates, life can abound in those places, even though the sun can't reach them, even though the water not too far from those is freezing cold. The pressure is insane.
I was just going to mention the pressure.
But there is life that makes it down there. So if you're looking for sort of something for inspiration to come up with a really strange form of life, look at things called a streamophile, and the ocean is probably one of the greatest places on Earth to find them.
That's where you find it. That's where you get the kaiju.
You're making stuff up.
Well, no, somebody else did.
Well, you're repeating fiction on the show. There's none of that, sir.
Oh, God. Well, it's been nice talking to y'all, guys. We got to cancel the show because of Jeff's new rule. Yeah, I wish I had invented kaiju. That'd be awesome.
Now, the next thing we're going to look at here are some cultures to look at for sort of seagoing inspiration. And this is not meant to be comprehensive.
So pirates.
There's no cultures.
Oh, what? Pirate culture? No?
Each of these cultures had their own version of pirates.
See, so, they're everywhere, Jeff.
Pirates are everywhere. That's why this episode is just packed full of pirates, even though we're not talking about them. Now,
yet.
So the first one, and one of the major overlooked sea powers on Earth, was China. I would say they're the most overlooked one, but they are one of the most overlooked one. China had a very extensive, their junk boats sailed all over the Indian Ocean, all over, obviously, the South China Sea. Now, there's even stories of Chinese supposedly making it to close to the West Coast, if not to the West Coast of the United States. They would send out for a while, I think it was during the Han Dynasty, massive armadas to sail around to essentially show off their wealth. And it might not have been the Han. It might have been the Song or another later dynasty, and I apologize if I got that wrong. But they had a very... And like they would literally... this massive fleet would show up, and they weren't there to take over, but they could have. So now they could have ever held it because they were way too far from home. But,
that's what I was going to say, yeah.
but I could totally see where...
beat you up
would
and
probably get them better
take
prices.
Your stuff.
That's right. Probably get the better prices at the local merchants, though. I usually think of them more for river-going boats. They had really amazing river boats in China with the Yangtze and the Yellow Rivers. But their ocean-going boats were really impressive, around too. And don't get me wrong, like Korea and Japan also had impressive boats too. But China is getting brought up here because a lot of times people don't think of them and navies, ocean-going navies. There is the Polynesians, obviously, but there's actually a group before them which actually were the genetic ancestors to the Polynesians, called the Lapita. The Lapita themselves were really interesting. They had a civilization around in the Stone Age that probably had a trade route the size of the Silk Road, which is like 3,000 miles, give or take, like a mile or two. And but essentially from Western New Guinea all the way to Somalia. Somalia.
I was about to say, do you mean Somalia?
Somalia. No, that would be even more impressive. Samoa.
Samoa.
Samoa, not
Gotcha.
Somalia.
Yeah, you totally lost me on that one.
And but essentially, they kind of broke down and went away. But they had a consistent culture through a large area and signs of advanced sea trade going on. So where the Polynesians sort of sailed out, their trading was more local. Typically, when they would go out in their ocean-going vessels, they would go really far out to like Hawaii, but there wasn't really trade like trade routes between Samoa and Hawaii, or Tahiti and Hawaii. So they would go and settle island chains over vast distances, the Polynesians, but the Lapita appeared to have a massive trade system going on. So they were probably the earliest major naval force on Earth. There's the Cole or the Kola. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. It's a southern Indian kingdom, which had a massive fleet and influenced areas from modern-day Indonesia to Sri Lanka, and they essentially Sri Lanka.
Sri Lanka. Okay, that's all I was about to ask.
I'm not sure what I actually said, but yeah, Sri Lanka, and so essentially there's a major Indian place to look at there too, and then of course there are several in Europe that we know of. There's a group called the Sea Peoples, which not much is known about, but they were kind of cool. They sort of blew up the Hittites. They sort of blew up Egypt. They sort of blew up the Mycenaean Greeks. They really terrorized the Eastern Mediterranean for a while, and might have been the progenitors to the Canaanites and possibly to this other group called the Phoenicians, which are a major sea power of the Mediterranean for a really long time. And them and the Greeks settled most of the Mediterranean basin themselves. Now, there were other people there sometimes, but pretty much, by the time of the Romans came around, most seaports on the Mediterranean were either related to Greece or to the Phoenicians, and with very few exceptions in between. And then, of course, there's a question about the Celts. There's some new evidence showing that there's a small place in northwestern Spain called Galicia, and it appears that all the Celtic people in Ireland and in England did not come from the Gauls in Gaul, or the Celts in Gaul. They came from Galicia, whose major musical instrument is a bagpipe. But it's actually, people kind of thought it was like the British Island Celts coming down and settling down there, but it looks like actually it went the other way, that during the Bronze Age, Celts from Galicia actually made it up the Atlantic Ocean into Ireland and into essentially the British Isles. So maybe they were, and we definitely know that they had boats. Don't know how extensively they were used, probably not much outside of local sea fishing, but they did do some traversing and settling via boat as well. Middle Ages, you have the Norse. Most of you probably know enough about them. The Byzantines, with the Greek fire and their impressive little ships that essentially helped keep them afloat for centuries after they should have fallen. And then the merchant republics are another really cool one, with Venice and Genoa and a few others that were around, not Pisa being another one. So there were a few of those, pretty much all in or around Italy. But they had major naval influences on the Mediterranean throughout the Middle Ages. And then, of course, you get into the Age of Sail with Portugal, Spain, the English and Dutch were all major naval powers, where like the English and the Dutch pretty much, that's the only thing that made them an empire, were naval forces. So there we go. And the most overlooked are Arabs. Everyone thinks of Arabs being these guys who were on camels going through deserts, and they did do a lot of that, but they had they pretty much especially from the Islamic period on, dominated the Indian Ocean sea trade, and for a long time, even part of the Mediterranean sea trade was dominated by the Arabs. Very, very impressive seagoing vessels where they had trade routes longer than the Silk Route on the ocean, making it all the way to China itself. So Arab traders really from essentially South Africa to China, were all over the place on the ocean. So, if you're looking for some inspiration on beefing up ocean-going cultures, look to some of those for some different or common things that really worked or really didn't work. But that's really it. That is sort of the world building and the sea episode. And since Michael is the old man by the sea, he would know all of this stuff already.
And the other thing is, I think that we should probably do a under the sea episode, because there's so much to be explored beneath the ocean. It's a whole
well, that's a tougher one, right?
Yeah.
Because we know so little about under the ocean. So it's a great place, that 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which might be better to talk about in the next episode, you can really do fantastical stuff, because there's really stuff that we're still learning, vast amounts of the ocean we really don't know anything about yet, so.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing. You figure we have very little on the surface of the planet that we have not explored yet, but 2/3 of our world is underwater, and we've seen very little of it. Like there's so much going on down there that we just can't get to. So it's like, who knows what else is down there? But if you wanted to make like a aquatic culture, like now you're talking about something totally different as far as a world building goes. Obviously, your tides and everything are going to come into play, but now we're getting into a lot of, we're going to be getting
that sounds like a fun build that we need to do at some point.
Aquatic culture build?
I think we needed to do an aquatic culture build.
I'm down.
I'm pretty sure we have to.
Can they be pirates?
They can be pirates.
Okay.
That's all they do.
Mermaid pirates. Mermaid pirates.
Aren't I beautiful?
I don't.
Yes, but you talk really creepy.
I don't know why I am so enamored with pirates. As of late, I have not been like watching pirate movies or reading pirate stories. I just love the idea. So
because pirates is one of those things that just stick with us forever.
So while we bring this to a close, oh my gosh, I just realized I haven't looked at our new members yet. I got it. Remind me before we get to the next episode. I have to double check that, so in the next episode we can get some shout outs, because I'm sure that there have been some people that have joined since the last couple episodes that I haven't shouted out. And when is this episode up?
Let me check my calendar here real quick. It's near the end of October.
End of October. Okay, so by the time you guys are hearing this episode, some of you will probably.
I've been in the group for months.
Some of you will probably already know, but I will have gotten back from.
I believe this is October 22nd.
Perfect. That will be the week. 23rd. Earlier in that week, I will have returned from my very first European trip, having gone to Germany. So welcome me back, even though I haven't left yet at the point of this recording.
Let me know. Was it awesome?
It was amazing, Jeff. I cannot wait to tell you about it. But we've run out of time on this episode, so it's going to have to wait.
All right, so the world building task of the day, Michael. What is the world building task of the day?
Create an ocean in your world. If it is a desert, flood. Yes. Oh, if it's a desert, flood it. I see.
That's right. You have to have an ocean in your world, even if you don't want one. Just flood your world if you have to, but have an ocean.
But what if that's the point? Like, what if you've built like an Arrakis style planet?
No.
What do you mean, no?
Not in this episode. That's a different episode. This episode, you have to flood it. In another episode, we'll make you dry it out. But in this episode, it's getting flooded.
Yeah, we can do a desert episode.
We can do a desert episode.
There was an anime that I watched a long time ago. I wish I could remember what it was, where they got to... It was like a good chunk of it, maybe all of it, was on a desert planet. And they talked about the deep sands. And, like, someone, like, drops a tank, you know, like a compressed air tank into it, and somebody like goes to grab it and they're like, no, move back, and it sinks into the sand, not quite like quicksand, but quickly, and then it explodes because of the pressure. And I thought, what an interesting idea, that sand in this world moves like water and behaves like water, but obviously it's a lot denser because it's small rocks, and it crushes things. It was such a cool concept. So someone, I stand by, someone could make a desert ocean.
Yes, you could. And I've actually seen that done before, too. And typically when you have those kind of settings, there's usually a glass portion where it's very extremely hot, where the sand's melted. So there's all kinds of things. But that's a different episode.
It is a different episode.
So this episode, you must flood your whole world if there's no water.
Well, do you know what happens if you have water, flood the whole world, Jeff? You get a water world.
No.
You just said to flood the whole world, and then you'd have a water world. Jeff wants water worlds, guys. He just said it. We all heard him say he wants water worlds.
Oh my goodness. Okay, so for the real world task, go watch Planet Earth from the BBC. Even though I say BBS in my show notes, it is actually the BBC who made Planet Earth. They have a lot. They talk about life on Earth. That's really cool. And so go watch the whole thing. Most of it's about the ocean. So skip all the land episodes. I'll make you watch the land episodes in a different one. And maybe the desert episode.
And for other fun, go watch Waterworld. And email Jeff your review and your character breakdowns. I want to know all about it. For really fun reading, go read about how the production, how like the movie was made. Yeah, that's a lot of interesting stuff there too.
I'm sure a lot of injuries in that one.
Probably. I don't remember that in particular, but they were plagued with difficulties. Mostly, I won't get into it.
Script related? Okay, so...
low blow, Jeff.
That was a little easy.
That was low. Like that was kind of low-hanging fruit for you, honestly.
I am low-hanging fruit, sir. All right, we'll see you next time, folks.
Thank you so much for listening to the World Builders Anvil. We would love it if you would share the World Builders Anvil with 2 of your friends, and so would they. If they are unfamiliar with podcasts, then you get to introduce them to the wonderful world of podcasting by showing them Stitcher or iTunes, or, best of all, just send them to our website, www.gardul.com. That's GARDUL.com.
Now strike while the mithril's hot.